Stansfield Smith, a comrade in Chicago in the United States, to talk about various aspects related to the current election process that is underway prior to the presidential elections in 2024 next year. So Stan, why don't you give us a breakdown of what you're currently doing and why you're interested in the election process?
Well, I'm always interested in the election process because it gives us an opportunity to intervene in some way. But that currently I'm working on the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition, and I'm on their coordinating committee trying to build the coalition. And here in Chicago, I'm on the Chicago Assange Defense Committee trying to publicize what the U.S. government is trying to do to Julian Assange. Those are and I put out the Venezuela Weekly for Alliance for Global Justice. Those are maybe the three things I'm doing right now.
Right. Thanks, Stan. One of the things I'm particularly interested in, because of recent articles that you've had published over the last few months, is it does seem extraordinary to outsiders the criminal proceedings that have been instigated by the Department of Justice under the Biden administration against ex-President Trump, and even against his lawyers. And they seem the whole process seems to be a complete caricature of the whole issue of free speech and so on. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised by that from an administration that has persecuted Julian Assange so brutally. And perhaps we could discuss Julian Assange's plight and the context of his imprisonment in another program. So something that puzzles people is why people outside the United States is why progressives and radicals in the United States aren't more concerned about the extreme abuse of the US justice system, or perhaps we should call it the injustice system, to go after Donald Trump. And you've written about this issue in the past. And what do you think is the meaning of people's apparent indifference on what some people still call the left to what's being done to Donald Trump and his lawyers?
Yeah, well, I think the most shocking thing about it is that this is the first time a sitting president is indicting his only real challenger in the 2024 election and trying to imprison him, and one of the charges against him is treason. That charging an ex-president with treason is pretty outrageous. To do it in the middle of a campaign, they're doing it now. They could have done it a year and a half or 2 years ago. They're waiting till the campaign. And Trump is actually now, I think, ahead in the polls. They're desperate. Well, it's not just the Democrats. It's a whole national security state is out to stop Trump from becoming president again. Now, I mean, this is, I think, the first time in U.S. history that a sitting president has tried to do that against his leading contender. Now, it would be an interesting question if Trump wasn't sure he was going to win in 2020. He charged Biden with treason, which he could have for having classified documents in his house, like Trump is charged with treason, violating the Espionage Act. Trump could have done that. What would have been the reaction if the Justice Department under Trump charged Biden with treason, say in July or August or September 2020? There would have been national outrage. But now, I don't see anything by other progressive-minded people. And even when I say, hey, this is an issue. This is like just civil rights issue. What they're doing against Trump, maybe you hate Trump, but they're doing it. They're going to do that to third-party people later. They're going to be doing this kind of stuff to us later. And if you just let them do this now, it's just going to make it easier to go after us later because they've set a precedent. Just like they giving these people January 6th, like 30 years in prison. Like, they could, how many people in 2020 and all the Black Lives Matter protests could they have given 30 years in prison for the same kind of things that they were doing there? But it is kind of shocking that people don't recognize, like, this is a real threat to our civil liberties, what they're doing to Trump. I mean, maybe we hate him, but, what they're doing to him is beyond what's called for. I think a lot of the problem with this is there is some kind of McCarthyism on the left. Like, if you say anything good about Trump, even defend Trump's right to run for president, or defend his right to free speech, or saying he's being framed up, or just questioning this whole thing, or questioning that he's actually a fascist, you are called like a Trump supporter, that you're soft on Trump. I mean, it's happened to me over and over and over and over. It's like, well, I know in this milieu, if I say anything good about Trump, they're going to stereotype me as a Trump supporter.
Yeah,
repeatedly, and I think a lot of leftist people are like, I don't want to be called that in this milieu, so I'm not going to say anything. So they just kind of silenced themselves like a lot of leftists did in the 1950s.
Yeah, I remember very much, Stan, we had a medical delegation visiting us earlier this year. And I was astonished when I was talking to one of the compañeros in the group about the obvious signs of Joe Biden's dementia. And another member in the group said, only Republicans say that. I couldn't believe it. I'm aware of the kind of thinking that, and this is supposedly somebody progressive and liberal and all the rest of it. But I'm interested by the fact that in your remarks just now, you didn't actually mention something that right-wing commentators have mentioned. I know you're familiar with the Robert Barnes, who occasionally appears on the Duran. He's a very well-known figure in right-wing circles, apparently a very tough and very talented lawyer. And he was on the Duran program, I think a couple of weeks ago. And his arguments were, and those of his interlocutors, Alexander Mercouris and is it Alex Christonophanu? I forget I forget the other.
I couldn't tell you how to pronounce his name. So.
Yeah. So anyway, and they were discussing the fact that essentially this comes down to an attack on freedom of speech, because in historically, in election after election, take the 2000 election, the Democrats themselves were questioning the election results, right? And essentially, as I understand it, apart from the ridiculous charge of the classified papers, the main charges against Donald Trump are that he tried to illegitimately overturn the election results, when in fact, and apart from the fact that there's chapter and verse about why, particularly in Georgia, apparently, there were very well founded complaints of electoral irregularities that were never allowed to reach the Georgia Supreme Court by one stratagem or another. But the paradoxical thing is that with these indictments now, according to Robert Barnes, in this discussion that he had on the Duran, it may well turn out to be the case that the indictments allow Donald Trump to put that evidence in his defense. And also, and he's perfectly entitled, just as the Democrats were in the year 2000, to say that he feels that the election result was unfair and to question it. And what do you think about those grounds in terms of why people on the left should be more concerned about the issue at all? Because it does seem to me fundamental for particularly in the United States, the issue of free speech be defended by people who regard themselves as progressive and radical. Do you think that's a fair concern?
Yeah, we should be defending. Well, first, I mean, it's not just 2000. I mean, 2004, Democrats, Barbara Boxer, and I forget who else, challenged the electors from Ohio when they were going to count the electors, like their version of January 6th. And what, 2016, they tried to get Trump electors to switch their vote, and some of them even got death threats to switch if they didn't switch their votes, and some of them did switch their votes from Trump to Biden to Clinton. The Democrats do the same thing. It's just, well, you know,
Right.
I mean, every time, I know from a long time, it's like Democrats lose an election, they say, well, you know, there's a lot of people say, well, this was stolen. You know, I suppose both of them steal elections in different places. But what you're asking me about free speech issue.
Yeah, and it just seems extraordinary that people in progressive and radical circles aren't more concerned about the really fundamental attack on free speech that the indictments against Donald Trump seem to represent.
Yes, I think a lot of them have what they call the Trump derangement syndrome. It's like, we got to stop Trump, whatever, doesn't matter what, just stop him. If the CIA and FBI are going to stop him, good. It's like this poll I read, I should mention, that CBS did when they asked Democrats and Republicans what their opinion of the FBI and CIA was back in October 2022. Said 79% of the Democrats said they thought the FBI was doing a good job, and 39% of the Republicans thought they were doing a good job. For the CIA, it was 69% of the Democrats and 29% of the Republicans. It's like, this is a reverse from, you know, when Bush was there in 20, years ago. It's like, now
Right.
the Democrats are pro FBI and CIA, and Republicans are against them. And what's the reason for that? It's basically, well, the FBI and the CIA were out to get Trump, and so, like, good, they're doing what we want. But it's, I mean, I don't think the terms, anyways, left and right make much sense now in the United States when you have all the Democrats in Congress supporting war, and the only ones who are voting against war are Republicans. And then you got the only ones I know who are speaking out in defense of Assange are, like, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene has actually spoken out in defense of Assange. The ones who are, you know, want to curtail the FBI, those are Republicans. It's these are switched. So how can they only, you know, when the people who are pro-war and pro-national security state are in the Democratic Party, and the ones that are speak out against it are in Republican Party, you can't say, well, the Republicans are right-wing and these pro-war Democrats are they're more left. I mean, that no longer makes any sense.
Right. I was astonished the other day when I saw an editorial. I don't know how I came across it. I think I was browsing a links page in another site, and I came across this editorial in the Jacobin, which is, unless I'm mistaken, it's supposed to be one of the leading progressive voices or outlets in the United States by some people's standards. And I was astonished to see that in their first paragraph, they were saying there's no alternative for genuine progressives except to support the Democrat Party. I couldn't believe it. What on earth is going on? And can you explain that?
No, I argue with some of the peace activist people here in Chicago, who are, like, opposed to the war in the U.S. war in Ukraine. It's like, I work with them around it, have protests around it, and they'll be advocating voting for more Democrats. And I was like, all these Democrats, all of them, every single one is pro-war. The only ones who are not And the only candidate who is anti-war, who says he'd end the war, is Donald Trump. So how can electing more of these Democrats going to help end this war? That doesn't matter. It's like they're just stuck in this mindset from, I don't know, at least 20 years ago, and it's probably our whole lives, that Democrats are the lesser evil. So you don't want Republicans elected. No
And
matter
how
how bad the Democrats are, you don't want Republicans elected. And it's like, well, this kind of world is over now. We're living in a different kind of world today.
So in that context where progressive principles seem to kind of been completely swept away, and you yourself and I myself, in the little example that I gave you, we know that people who think of themselves as progressive and liberal can actually be extremely reactionary, and are extremely reactionary, as you've just pointed out, in terms of their support for the war. So, how do you address that issue that you've just raised, that in some senses, some Republicans or some right-wingers, if one has to use those terms, actually have more moral positions, or actually, in fact, more progressive positions than the progressives and liberals that you'd expect to be anti-war and so on? And do you think, I read in one of your articles, you mentioned the example of Fred Hampton and the way that he bridged the political divide between his cause, the cause of black liberation in the United States, and the cause of working class liberation with right-wing groups from working class backgrounds. And how relevant is that example now?
Oh, yeah, well, that's a good example. But we should remember that, I mean, a lot of those white, well, they had Confederate flags on their armbands, and I suppose they were racist, but in all fairness to racists, liberals are almost just as racist. So, um, he did outreach to Appalachian whites in the north side of Chicago. And I can understand, though, a lot of why they have Confederate flags on their armbands back then, because, Southerners were always discriminated against. So the Northerners always looked down on them. I was brought up that way. The people from the South are, they're all stupid, reactionary, they're dirty, and so, they're treated like, second-class white people. And so I could see, well, this, having a Confederate flag is just kind of, standing up for your Southern identity. Doesn't mean that you subscribe to slavery or anything. But Fred Hampton, he went in, worked with them, and effectively worked with them by sitting to, well, I think it wasn't exactly, he had sent some other representative, I forget his name, who spent a lot of time working with them over his name was Robert E. Lee, I think. He said, well, he said his name was taken from a Southern general, which gave him an in
Right.
with these Appalachian, this group. But he just listened to them and what their complaints were, and he told them what his complaints were about, the housing and everything, and the police brutality in Chicago, and they all got to see they had something in common. And they said, we should be fighting the same enemy, not each other. That only benefits our enemy that we do that. And they formed the first Rainbow Coalition in Chicago, along with, Puerto Rican groups in Chicago. That was how Jesse Jackson started the second Rainbow Coalition, based on Fred Hampton's first Rainbow Coalition. It's I mean, if you're going to call people like right wing, then you're just going to write them off. But I can say, like, I worked on the Cuban 5 case for years, and I have rallies about, them, and I have rallies to help defend Venezuela, Nicaragua, free Assange, no war in Ukraine. And for 20 some years, I've had a couple that have, I mean, basically they're LaRouches. They come and they support us and they donate, and I get along with them well, and they're Irish like you, and they agree with everything that I say, and they agree with all the leaflets I put out. But they got their ideology from LaRouche. Now, am I going to say they're right wing? But in practice, they are not. They're anti-imperialist. They came to that anti-imperialist point of view from reading LaRouche. And we should also remember, I was listening to a speech by Malcolm X in 1964, and he said, 5 years ago, I believed that Elijah Muhammad was actually divine. So you can see in 5 years how Malcolm X's thinking changed. So people's thinkings can change through experience by talking to other people and you talking to them. And to just write them off and you don't talk to them is really, it's not the way to build any movement. You have to try to listen to people, see it from their point of view, and see how you can work in common on certain issues. And then you realize, well, we're not enemies, and maybe we disagree on that, but we work together fine, and that's what's important.
And how relevant do you think that is in? Sorry, Stan. How relevant do you think that way of thinking is to the election process that's getting underway now in the United States in the run-up to the presidential elections next year? And do you think that kind of bridge building, sharing common concerns, do you think that's a possible way forward to build political consensus that may be useful in the electoral context that's developing at the moment?
Oh, well, yeah, I think in elections is probably easier because my experience of talking, Democrats and Republican voters is that probably 99% of them say, well, they're both no good, but, I'm going to vote lesser evil because that's the only choice I got. And some will say, that's why I'm voting Republican. And the other ones will say, that's why I'm voting Democrat. And they can agree on all these issues. The corporations run the parties, big business and the banks run the parties. They don't serve little people like us. But they say, well, so I'm voting for the one who I think is going to help us a little more. It's either party. So a lot of ways they both agree. They just have a difference of opinion on who's the lesser evil.
What do you think of the arguments of people like Mark Smith, for example, who argues that a stronger political option than that kind of lesser evil kind of thinking is to boycott the elections completely and build up a consensus against the electoral system that calls into question its legitimacy?
Well, up to the last election, I'd say turnout was probably less than 50% anyways. First, they only count registered voters. When they say what the percent to vote, it's only registered voters. And registered voters is not very close to 100% of eligible voters. So the percent of actual eligible voters, people 18 years old or over who vote, it's a minority, and it's always been a minority. Except I think for the last election, maybe it was more than 50%. But boycotting it is, I don't know if that would really make a difference. I mean, the issue for me is that when it's election season, people are more willing to talk about politics than they are like sports, because it's more in the news and it's more in the air, and then there are rallies you can go to. And It gives me an opportunity to bring up issues that they're raising and to get out literature to people about whatever the subject is, like free Assange or something, or whatever I was working for in the last election, like end the blockade of Venezuela or whatever it might be. So it's a good opportunity to do political work because people are more interested in political issues during election time. But I don't think no elections ever solve anything.
Right. What do you
But
think
maybe
about?
like also there's sometimes like Bernie Sanders would say some very good stuff that's like, oh, you can get a quote from this guy. It's not just uh, me saying this. Bernie Sanders says this. So that helps. So maybe there is a problem when you get people like Bernie Sanders repeatedly saying, you know, we're going to fight the corporate Democrats and Republicans, and then they end up endorsing the corporate Democrats.
Yeah, they call
What
it
he thought he
sheepdog.
was going to do. I think that has a demoralizing effect on young people and other people who are it's like, well, you can't trust any of these people.
Yeah, the late great Glenn Ford used to talk about. I don't know if he coined the phrase, but he used to talk about sheepdogging, didn't he?
Mhm.
So, uh, looking more closely at the election, what do you think about the argument of people who, despite Robert Kennedy Jr.'s what I regard as odious Zionist opinions, he is uh, apparently, a powerful voice against war. And so um, some people will argue it's important to support RFK Jr. because he's our best chance to avoid a nuclear war. And what do you think about that kind of argument?
Well, if you're going to say who's more likely to get in, who would stop the war, it would be Trump, not RFK. RFK is not going to get in. They're not
Right.
going to let him win the Democratic Party nomination. Uh, well, he's not, I mean, even if they got in, I don't know if he could stop the war anyways. I mean, the president, in the end, doesn't really decide upon war. Like when Trump was in, he wanted the U.S. troops out of Syria, out of Iraq, and out of Afghanistan, and the military just like, no, we're not doing that. He couldn't do much about it. Um, but looking to a president to, I mean, it's good if he's speaking, help publicize his speeches where he says we should get out of Ukraine, but he's not going to get elected. And if he is elected, I can't be sure that he would actually be doing what he's saying he's going to do now, because so many of them, you know, most of what they say before they get elected disappears after they win the election. You could say that about AOC or Brandon Johnson, the progressive mayor we now have in Chicago. It's like they're the same as all the other corporate Democrats. Um, so I don't know what he would do, but at least he raises the issue. It's like, at least you can say, well, RFK is against the war. It's not just me talking. You can't just write it off as me saying this, but you got real candidates pointing out what's wrong with the war. And they get on TV and they can talk about it. That's very good. It helps publicize anti-war sentiment.
Right. So we're almost up to the half hour, Stan. And do you have any other points that you'd like to make in relation to these elections and what they may mean for U.S. society over the next year or so?
Well, if the Democrats or national security state don't let Trump be a candidate, that's a serious blow to all of our rights. We're in big trouble because they're going to use that against any third party for sure. Then they would have a precedent. That's the most dangerous thing about this election. Um, you know, I already think national security state basically runs the country, but they're just like consolidating their grip over the government. I mean,
Right.
they're telling the American people, you're not going to decide who's going to be president. We're going to tell you who's going to be president. It's going to be Joe Biden. You can vote for other people who are not going to win, but we're not going to let you vote for somebody who probably may win. Like, they're deciding who's going to be the president now in this election. It's almost like pretty explicit.
Right. Well, Stan, thank you very much for giving us your views and guidance about, these important issues. And I do hope we'll have a chance to talk perhaps in the future about the case of Julian Assange and what it means for freedoms of people in the United States and the rest of the world. But anyway, in any case, thank you very much for joining me for this conversation, and I look forward to talking to you again before too long.
Okay, well, thank you for having me on your show, and I encourage everybody to look at Tortilla con Sal and look at it regularly, because it has very good news about Nicaragua and other issues, especially what you write. So thank you for
Thanks.
your work.
Thank you, Stan.
Okay,
Take care now.
bye.
Bye-bye.